Thank you very much for the kind introduction and good morning, and thank you all for being here early on a Saturday morning after last night. Greatly appreciated to see you all here. My name is Ciarán Mahon, and I'm going to be talking about, as you can see, psychology and social media. This is, I forgot the clicker. This is a topic which I've been researching for quite some time, and in fact it sounds a little bit like a confession, but it has now been 8 years since my last time at PSI, and funnily enough, the last time I was at PSI I was also talking about Facebook and psychology, so social media as well. That was 2010. I don't know if any of you remember. 2010, Facebook was just sort of breaking into public consciousness. Now, it had been founded in 2004, but particularly in this part of the world, it was only really starting to break through. So I guess in those times, Facebook and social media, it was still frivolous a little bit. It was still something by college students. In those days, I reviewed 66 papers that had been published on social media at the time, and that was more or less everything that was worth reading at the time. There were some concerns about privacy, and lots of lecturers and professionals were concerned about people putting up too much information. So students putting up things on social media, and it was just a little bit embarrassing. That was kind of the height of the concerns. And the thing is, when we come to today, things are a little bit different. When we talk about the societal impact of social media today, we have, I'm sure you can still read it in the newspapers today, and you will still be able to read about it in newspapers for a couple of weeks, if not longer to come, about the harassment, the sexual harassment cases, which have been breaking in the news almost day in, day out for the last month. And it did start with one woman pointing the finger at Harvey Weinstein, but it really took off when the hashtag #MeToo circulated, and there was huge amounts of tweets within 24 hours, and that's where it really sort of kicked off. We also have even still the continuing unfolding crisis that is the 2016 general election in America, the fake news campaign. Facebook recently admitted that it had now calculated that pretty much half of all of its American users had been served with ads or propaganda ads from Russia. There's a huge number, a huge amount of influence, which, if we were to look back in 2010, Obama had just used Facebook to get elected, and it was all sunny and nice. Nobody thought that it could turn so badly or to such influence. And of course, then there's other things as well. The terrorism, radicalization. Maura Conway of DCU estimated that at its height, Islamic State controlled about 90,000 Twitter accounts. So, and this is only the tip of the iceberg, and these are all things which I have come across in the last couple of weeks. I didn't do a deep dive on this. This was all very easy to find, the societal impact of social media today. So what I'm trying to get across to psychology and psychologists today is two main messages. And the first is, there has been a huge shift in the last 8 years since I was away. I wasn't responsible for it, but it did happen since I was last at PSI. There's been a big change in how we relate to each other. I could have given you graphs on the billions of people that are now on social media. 2 billion people on Facebook, or 2 billion people on social media. You have hundreds of millions on other different accounts. It wasn't like that 8 years ago. It has been a big change. And the other thing that I want to say is that I think this is getting away from psychology. I think psychology has lost oversight of this problem. And let me explain. So, 8 years ago, when I was looking at the research, and this is looking through PsycInfo, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, papers with social media or social networking, similar terms in their abstracts. So 2009, you can see not very many papers. It wasn't really much of an interest. But then after that, it kind of took off. to the point where last year there was 1,500 papers published on PsycInfo about social media. That's a huge amount. Now, as I say, in 2010, I could read them all before that paper. I'm going to put my hand up now and admit that I haven't read all of those papers. But I have reviewed them, and the trends, I have to say, are a little bit concerning. The first thing I've noticed is that, and some of you might not be very surprised by this, but they're mostly quantitative papers. Very few qualitative papers, which I find quite disturbing. Just a little bit disappointing. And you would say, well, social science is largely quantitative by numbers, and but that's actually exacerbated when you look at social media. There's a lot, the proportion is bigger. So we don't have any real substantial deep dives into social media behavior. The other thing I noticed as well is that you say this is PsycInfo, so but it's a wider social science database. Most of the topics, I would say, of these 1,500 papers published last year, I would say about 1,200, if not 1,300, I could categorize as being of psychological interest. So it's not law, it's not engineering, it's not sociology. They're quite, they're pretty psychological papers. So it's things that psychologists should be interested in, or that are of relevance to psychology. But what you do find is that they're not actually published in psychology journals. They're all in interdisciplinary journals. Of those 1,500 papers, only 8 were published by APA journals. None by BPS, none by Canadian Psychology. So it's all interdisciplinary. And my point is that there's a lot of psychological research on social media going on, but I don't think it's being done by psychologists. And that I find a little bit concerning. The other thing, and this is only PsycInfo, this is where my real concern for the discipline of psychology is that there was another 1,200 papers published by the Association of Computer Machinery. And you may have come across these. It's like IEEE, it's computer science, computer engineering, it's programming, machine learning, algorithms, all of those very technical papers. And they are very, very interested in social media. And why are they interested in social media? Because there's huge amounts of data there which they can analyze and which they can interpret and which is very psychological. And where this comes to, and this is what I want psychologists, if you're not, I kind of assume that nobody knows this. So if you've known this before, I'm sorry, but I really want to hammer home this point. What we're dealing with now is a field that I would call computational psychiatry. So this is a paper which was published 3 years ago. This is a team which is publishing quite a lot of research. They are trying to predict when somebody will suffer an experience of a depressive episode by analyzing their social media account. So they've taken a lot of Twitter data and then they analyze it to try and predict when this person is going to suffer a depressive episode. There's a lot of research being done like this, which, here's another one, trying to discover when changes in somebody's patterns of suicidal ideation by analyzing their social media data. Now, these papers, I have to say, are quite thin on ethics, they're quite thin on participant consent, quite thin on participant dignity, on outreach and things like that. It's more to do with taking all of the data and analyzing it for psychiatric conditions. There's a lot of it. Here's another one, eating disorders, online eating disorder communities, analyzing that for severity of mental illness. This is really psychologists, clinical psychologists' bread and butter, but this research is being done by engineers. Here's another one, predicting postpartum changes in emotion and social behavior via social media. So it's trying to predict when a woman gives birth, is she going to suffer postpartum depression, and can we tell that by analyzing her Twitter account, which I find a little bit unusual. There's a real zinger of a line in there where they say, well, we realized that after giving birth, certain women weren't as active on social media as before giving birth. I think, maybe that's because they were kind of busy. And there's more, measuring depression in populations as well. A lot of this research would have started by analysing personality through social media, and then it seemed like a natural step on from that to start going into psychiatric conditions. I find a lot of this a little bit, it just sets off my spidey senses when I go, I'm not entirely sure this is completely ethical. I would prefer if you people were doing this research rather than engineers. But it gets better. What's going to come next? This is a paper which was published recently in the Journal of Medical Internet Research. Is a bot which sits on Facebook Messenger and which delivers automated cognitive behavioral therapy. So it uses a person's social media account and it interacts with them and talks to them. And I can see a lot more of these things coming because they are pretty cheap to build. It's fairly automated, and of course the spread is massive. There are more of these coming. There are a few more of them on the market, and I can see this being, all you have to do is add the social media data together, and this becomes a form of sort of automated therapy. And this is the thing which I want psychologists to think about, is that first and foremost, when you think about how our societies operate, our neoliberal societies such as ours and the wider Western society, if you think about it, if you went to a government and you said, we're going to try and solve mental health problems, people in this room would say, well, we'll take that money and we will train clinical psychologists and therapists and counsellors. It'll take about 10 years. They'll probably still disagree with each other afterwards, and they'll be able to see maybe, 4 or 5 clients a day, and that's about it. Or if you go to a funder and you say, well, it's going to be artificial intelligence, it's going to be big data, and we're going to solve your mental health problems, and we're going to be able to do it in the next year or two. I think we should be a little bit scared about this. But, as I say, although this is coming down the tracks, I do think that there are very clear strategies for psychologists and psychology to actually overcome this. And if you know this guy, Joseph Weizenbaum was the man who wrote the first therapy program, ELIZA, which was based on sort of Rogerian reflection back. And he wrote a book in 1976, 40 years ago, and he said, we can't do it this way. His point is, the point is that there are some human functions which ought not to be substituted. It has nothing got to do with what computers can or cannot do. Respect, understanding, and love are not technical problems. There are some things in this world that are worth fighting for, and human-to-human therapy is one of them. I think we have to start from this point on a point of morality, that people deserve human contact in counselling. We start from that point. But there's also a technical sort of critique that we can have of these papers. When you actually scratch the surface of these papers, as I have done, of this research basis, the first thing that I would, as a theoretician of psychology, say is, can we actually measure psychological concepts to begin with? Can we actually measure emotion? Some of you might like to read a book by Joel Michel called The Psychometrician's Fallacy. It's worth reading. That's just the first assumption that we have to bear in mind with this research. Second one is the DSM. Now, I know the DSM is probably the best we have, but it certainly does have assumptions which are worth investigating. All of this research that I've spoken about all has a basis in the DSM. So that's another level of assumption. Another level of assumption is the LUC, which some of you might be familiar with, the Linguistic and Word Inquiry Count. That in itself also has a set of assumptions. It doesn't take into account context. It doesn't read irony. The other level of assumption is the representativeness of Twitter. I'm talking about Twitter here because most of these papers are based on Twitter data. Now, the reason why they're looking at Twitter and not Facebook, which is an awful lot more people and a lot more representative, is because Facebook doesn't allow you access to its data. Twitter allows you access to what they call the fire hose. But is Twitter actually representative of a population at large? I don't think so. And the final level of assumptions is the weird samples, which runs the whole way through social science research, but is very much the case in social media research because it's based on the Western educated industrialized countries and mostly due to student samples. So what I'm saying is that this body of research, more than any, has what I call a Jenga tower of assumptions. And I think when you start critiquing this research, the way it looks, particularly at mental health, I don't think it stands up to scrutiny. But there is another level of critique to this, which I think is very important. Yeah, see the Jenga tower falls once you examine it. Did I get that across? I think it. The other thing, though, which is very important, and I'm sure many of you psychologists will be aware of the replication crisis, which is currently hitting social psychology and other areas of social science. I think this is particularly acute within social media studies. This is there's a page from a graphic that I picked up a couple of weeks ago, and this is to do with Facebook pages and the level of interaction that publishers were seeing. So newspapers and so on, when they publish stories on Facebook. And this was a Slovak company, and they noticed that somehow all of their interactions just, you can see here, just all dropped off suddenly. And they were like, why is nobody reading our newspaper anymore? And the reason for this was that Facebook just simply decided to change the design of where the pages were put. Didn't inform them, there was no real warning of this. And so all of their advertising money and everything went down. What this means is that fundamentally, if you're investigating social media, if you think about it, Twitter just introduced 240 characters. How do you compare data from 208 or 280 characters to 140 characters? It's not commensurable. And this is a problem which is noted in the research. Recent review of social media papers looked at 505 papers. They actually read them all, and they found that of the 505 papers, only one of them could actually be replicated, actually met the standard criteria. So we're afraid of this massive amount of social media research, but actually how much of it is, solid science? I don't think much of it is. So maybe we should, breathe easily a little bit. But to conclude, what should psychologists do? So here come the memes. First of all, I have to say, an awful lot of commentary on social media and online safety generally said, it's not quite delete your account, but it is, just turn it off. We have to move away from that. I think we have to get to a point where we accept that social media is here. It is fundamentally changing our societies. We have to take a more nuanced and more critical and a more interpretive approach to how psychologists deal with social media. We have to get a little bit more involved. I also think that scientists, particularly empirical scientists, have to be very, very careful when it comes to big data. There is a phenomenon which some of you may have come across called online disinhibition. When you go online, you sort of you lose your sense of self. There's a phenomenon which I've called out before called N-line disinhibition. It's when a social scientist gets a big data file and their eyes glaze over and ethics and everything else goes out the window. I think we really have to be very, very careful about dealing with empirical research and big data files, particularly the sort of thing that you come across in social media. I would say to psychologists and social scientists, I just want more qualitative research. I want deeper, in-depth studies that actually scratch below the surface of what's happening. And I would finally say, psychologists are the good guys here. I want the psychologists to read social media. I want psychologists to do good research that respects participants' dignity and privacy, that understands informed consent, and that understands the dignity of the individual should be at the heart of all of our research and everything that we do. And I think that that is starting to fall apart in an awful lot of social media studies, which, to my mind, are basically surveillance. So that's my urging to psychologists to get more involved with social media. And to conclude, you will hopefully be able to read more of this in my forthcoming books. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ciarán, for that